My parents sold the house. Walter left me behind my back. They forged my name on the papers and told everyone I was too emotional to handle it. The house wasn't just wood and nails. It was my grandfather's voice in every creak of the floor, his scent in the library of old maps. The salt air, he said, would always remind me of him. Losing him was already unbearable, but realizing my own family stripped away the one promise he made me, it burned deeper than grief. They thought I wouldn't fight. They thought I'd fold. But Walter left a clause hidden in plain sight, meant only for me. And when I found it, everything began to unravel. My name is Ethan, and this is my story. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love hearing how far my story can reach. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. And if my story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe. It helps me keep sharing the truth, and it means the world to know you're standing with me. The house greeted me with silence, the kind that presses against your ribs. 1 week after my grandfather's funeral, I turned the old brass key in the lock, only to find fresh scratches around the keyhole like someone had already claimed what wasn't theirs. The air inside smelled of salt and old leather just as I remembered, but the warmth of memory was stripped away by the sight of cardboard boxes stacked in neat rows stamped with black marker "Donate" or "Discard." My belongings had been swept into corners as though my life were clutter to be erased. The floor groaned beneath my shoes the same way it had under Walter's. And for a moment, I closed my eyes, pretending he was still here, pacing slowly in the library. But when I opened them, the betrayal screamed louder. On the front porch, a new mailbox plate gleamed under the fading light. Baker. Not Vale. My family hadn't just taken the house. They'd replaced the name. I wandered into the library, the heart of the home where the smell of leather bindings and salt air lingered. That's when I saw it on the desk, a notebook worn brown leather. My initials etched into the cover EV. My grandfather's handwriting filled the first page, uneven but steady. If they take the house, find the key in the light. The words stopped my breath. A puzzle, a message meant only for me. Buddy Walter's old Labrador lifted his head from the corner, groaning as he recognized me. When I knelt and touched his fur, memories surged. Summer afternoons, spent sanding the boat with Walter Buddy sprawled across the dock. The three of us bound by work and laughter. The photo frame on the shelf had been turned face down. I picked it up and brushed off dust. Me, Walter and Buddy all younger, frozen in sunlight. Someone had tried to bury this memory too. My phone buzzed, a notification. Trevor Baker had posted a picture of himself on the porch captioned with smug finality. Some people cling to things instead of letting go. Grandpa deserves peace. The comments echoed his judgment, painting me greedy ungrateful. Rage swelled in my throat, thick as the salt air. I lifted my eyes to the chandelier above. Crystal droplets caught the setting sun, scattering fractured light across the floor. One screw shone a different color, slightly loose as if calling to me. Walter's words rang in my head, the key in the light. I whispered into the empty library. I'll catalog the truth the way I catalog every archive. Piece by piece, I'll put it back together. And in that moment, standing under fractured light, grief hardened into resolve. I didn't have to wait long before my parents confronted me. We sat in the living room where Walter's chair had been removed, leaving only an empty space that felt like a wound. My mother, Linda, immaculate as ever, folded her manicured hands and delivered her verdict. The house has been sold through the family trust. Ethan, you're too emotional to manage property. This way, everyone can move on. My father, Thomas added softly, it's for the best. Let go, son. Let go. As if grief were a coat I could shrug off, I reached into my satchel and pulled out a folder. One by one, I laid evidence across the coffee table: boarding passes from Savannah to Philadelphia hotel, confirmations and email thread stamped November 16th, a conference badge still clipped to its lanyard. On the day you claim I signed, I was here. I slid a printed photograph across the table, me standing on a panel stage timestamp glowing at the bottom corner. Philadelphia, November 16th, 11:18 a.m. Linda's smile tightened. She produced a copy of the contract. Neat signatures on the last page. You signed electronically. It was all very proper. She pushed it toward me like closing a deal. I didn't flinch. The will requires my signature in person with 2 independent witnesses. That was Walter's clause. Electronic doesn't count. My voice was steady, sharper than I expected. I examined the notary's stamp. The ink had bled faintly, edges blurred with age. I scanned the date. The commission had expired months earlier, and then the witnesses' names: Trevor Baker, Colin Wade, a beneficiary, and the buyer, both prohibited under the clause. I looked up. This contract isn't just flawed, it's void. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. Linda pressed her lips together, a vein twitching in her temple. They'd expected me to crumble under their authority, not to lay out a chain of evidence like an archivist dissecting forgery. Later at my desk, I opened my laptop and sifted through more files, retracing every timestamp, every metadata tag like they were fragile pieces of parchment in need of restoration. When I pulled up the photo from Philadelphia again, I noticed the digital board in the background. Philadelphia Nov, 16/11:18 a.m. Proof embedded. Not just in paper, but in pixels, I whispered to myself. They didn't count on metadata. And as I sat alone, scanning the dim light of the library, the chandelier flickered above me. Walter's clue lingered in my mind. The key was still waiting. But first, I had to dismantle every lie they'd built. By late afternoon, the house had the stale quiet of a museum after closing, except for the wind forcing its way down the hallway, and Buddy's slow, loyal breathing at my heel. I stood in the living room, surrounded by cardboard verdicts, donate, discard, and felt that old curatorial impulse rise in me. You don't fight chaos by shouting. You fight it by labeling, dating, preserving. I pulled on nitrile gloves out of habit more than need and started opening boxes. Most were clothes-framed diplomas, a dented picture of my high school rowing team. Then I found it buried under a stack of dish towels, my mother's old laptop, the one with the hairline crack on the corner, and the keyboard glossed by years of perfect nails. I pressed the power button. It woke up without a password prompt, as if the machine itself believed in my right to be here. The desktop bloomed with folders named things like Family Trust and Closings. A banner at the top told Messages was signed in. I didn't breathe. I clicked. Conversation threads populated the screen in bubbles of blue and gray, all dates and names, the boring architecture of betrayal. I scrolled back to November. There it was. Notary 11/16 confirmed. Another bubble. Ethan is in Philadelphia that day. Another change locks by Friday. A separate thread with Trevor replaced the mailbox nameplate. His reply came back with a selfie smirking, the Baker plate shining beneath his hand. I screenshot everything and exported the entire logs archive, setting time zone settings to make sure nothing could be disputed later. Emails next. A thread labeled Offer Terms Final opened to reveal my name in a subject line as though I were an attachment, not a person. I scanned down and hit the first shock of the evening from Colin Wade. Better to substitute the nautical chart with a reproduction before delivery, he wrote. No reason to risk damage during transport. Below it, my mother's reply. Handled by Wednesday. My back tightened the same way it does when I lift an oversized ledger the wrong way. The house wasn't the only target. The maps were Walter's maps. His life's work. The inked coastlines. He trusted me to understand. I kept digging. In documents, I found a draft letter that made my hands go cold. Subject Ethan consents. The body used my voice while saying something I would never say. Track changes were still on. Author Linda T. My name had been pasted in like a label on a jar. I printed the document to PDF, embedded the editing pane in the capture, and saved it with the machine, serial number, and current time. You don't just save files in my world, you preserve providence. Buddy nudged my knee, pulling me back into the room. Through the front window, I could see a sliver of porch, the corner where Trevor had filmed himself like a conquering heir. I opened his profile and downloaded every live stream featuring the house, noting dates, geotags, comments where he said things like, "Home sweet home." It wasn't possession in any legal sense, but it was evidence of public claim, useful for context, for tone, for the way juries feel the truth even before they see it. The light had shifted by the time I returned to the library. The chandelier threw thin beams across the map wall, slicing the room into careful rows like a reading room after last call. I stood under it and tapped the odd screw with my fingernail. The note rang hollow, a small mechanical throat clearing itself. Cold air slipped down the hallway, and the screw shivered in the draft just enough to reveal a seam. I pictured my grandfather's hands, the little smile he wore when he thought he'd been clever. Before I touched it, I sat at the desk and cataloged what I had. Message logs exported with check sums. Email threads saved to PDF with headers intact. The fake consent letter preserved with the author field visible. Trevor's videos. And the worst line in a day full of bad lines captured forever from a thread between my parents. He's too dreamy to fight back. The word stuck in my throat like a splinter. I annotated it anyway. If you don't write it down, people insist it didn't happen. My phone buzzed with a payment alert. Not to me, to a small account under Trevor's name I didn't recognize, flagged in one of the emails as a reimbursement channel. I jotted the last 4 digits and copied the date. Every fraud has a rhythm, a metronome. You just have to hear it. The wind pushed harder, rattling the windows. I looked up at the chandelier again. The screw had a faint smear of polish around it, different from the rest, like someone had wiped it once and left the job unfinished. Walter's note kept repeating in my head, "Find the key," and the light and memory rose to meet at nights when we would turn out every lamp but this one. And he'd read weathered margins from a chart, the chandelier glinting like a low constellation. I reached for the step stool and stopped. Not because I doubted what I would find, but because I could hear Grace's voice in my head the way she paused before she spoke, as if words were levers, and you had to place them carefully or the whole thing would tip. I dialed her number and sent a tight bundle of files while the phone rang the exports, the screenshots, the PDFs. She answered on the second chime, her tone so even it calmed the room. I summarized in clipped phrases like reading a case caption aloud. There was a silence at the end I could feel collecting in the chandelier's glass. "Preserve the library exactly as it is," she said finally, "and do not turn that screw until I'm there." I set the step stool aside. Buddy sighed and pressed his head to my ankle. The wind eased like the house had accepted the decision. The screw held its breath and waited with me. And so did I, recording the time in my notes, drawing a small star by the entry, a key in the light. I knew where it was. The harder question was what it would open. Morning came brittle and bright, the kind of coastal light that makes everything look newly cut. Grace met me at the door with a canvas bag and a nod that passed for warmth. We went straight to the library. She set out a small kit on the desk. Lint-free cloths, a velvet-lined tray envelopes for chain of custody. Lawyers don't just argue. The good ones treat evidence the way I treat parchment. She looked up at the chandelier and then at me. "Let's do this deliberately." I studied the step stool while she climbed. The odd screw turned with a clean resistance, as if it had been waiting for the right touch. When it came free, a tiny cavity revealed itself in the armature, and something metallic slipped against metal. Grace cupped her hand underneath. A small key fell into her palm, dull with age, where fingers would have polished it bright along one edge where it had rubbed against the hidden channel for years. She placed it in the tray, and we both exhaled. The map wall was to our left, a familiar grid of coasts and soundings. I ran my hand along the molding behind the tallest case until my fingers found a depression shaped like nothing except intention. The key turned there, snug and certain, and a thin panel released with a sigh of wood that had been holding its breath. Inside, the smell of paper and dry glue bloomed sweet and a little sad. A shallow cavity held a wooden box no bigger than a hardcover. I lifted it out and set it beside the key. The lid opened on graphite-sketched initials HV, and a letter in my grandfather's hand lay folded on top. I recognized the cadence before I read the words. He apologized for hiding what should have been open and then explained why he had anyway. If they could take the house, he wrote, they would as surely take the history. He told me to keep the beacon, to guard what was meant to guide, not to hoard. Under the letter lay a thumb drive, a second envelope of receipts, and a map that looked like the one on the wall, except it didn't. Even from 2 feet away, I could see the ink sitting high on the fibers, unbitten by time. The fake had the posture of a fake. We documented everything. Grace photographed the box, the position of each item. My hands gloved as I lifted the map the way the light hit the paper so the fresh ink's sheen was obvious. The thumb drive went first into a write-protected reader, then into her laptop. Folders stacked the screen like ledgers, scans of invoices from a specialty print shop, emails negotiating delivery dates for reproductions, a ledger of transfers marked innocently as archival restoration. There were spreadsheets with unit prices and an entry that made Grace lean forward. It tracked a payout scheduled for the day after the closing. The memo line read simply, "Chart against the wall." The map that had hung there for years revealed its own betrayal once we knew where to look. The edges were too crisp, the black too clean, the blues just a little too eager. I tilted it until the chandelier struck it dead on and watched the surface flare in a way old inks never do. On the thumb drive, we found images of the real chart under direct light, a high-resolution series clearly designed to guide a reproduction. The file info showed who had captured them and when. Trevor's name appeared in the image metadata, and there were outbound emails to a contractor overseas with a quoted insurance value attached that made my stomach tilt. $4 million. Grace labeled the envelopes and had me initial each seal. We propped the false map back against the wall exactly as we'd found it. The deception carrying on for one more day in the service of a cleaner reveal. Before we closed the cavity, I unfolded the remainder of the letter. My grandfather wrote about pressure he had refused late-night conversations at the dining table. Documents slid toward him with polite menace requests that sounded like favors and felt like handcuffs. If he wouldn't sign, they'd try to move through me, he wrote. Because love makes a person soft in the places paperwork can't reach. He had seen this coming as clearly as he once read on the horizon. There was one more object at the bottom of the box tucked under the receipts. A cassette in a plastic shell with a strip of masking tape labeled in his neat, stubborn script. I hadn't seen a player in this house for years, but Grace had thought of everything. She produced a little handheld unit with fresh batteries and slid the tape in. The player clicked word, and then my grandfather's voice filled the room. The sound quality was thin, but the tone was exactly as I remembered, half patience and half iron. He spoke to me, but also to time. He said he knew this day might come, that secrets aren't kept to deceive, but to protect what can't defend itself. He told me I would want to rage. He told me to document instead. He named the chart the one that mattered, the shipping lane that defined a century of the city's fortunes. He said the true one had been moved once for safekeeping, that Hank knew how to find it if the wall had been compromised. I paused the player and stared at the false map in its pretty frame. I thought of Trevor Baker sending high-resolution images across an ocean like smuggled artifacts, and of Colin Wade's email telling my mother to swap the chart before delivery, as if history were a throw pillow you could exchange on the way out the door. I thought of the phrase they used for me in their messages, too dreamy to fight, and felt a clarity I had been missing since the funeral. Dreaming had nothing to do with it. Remembering did. We closed the cavity. Grace secured the key, the box, the drive, and the letter in her bag with a written inventory. She made a quick call to set up a preservation order and a chain of custody courier. I made a different call, one that began with Hank picking up on the second ring and ended with his soft, "I wondered when you'd find it." He told me he had something for me, and that it belonged to the house more than it ever belonged to a person. Before we left, I stood under the chandelier one more time. The empty arm where the screw had been opened felt like a mouth that had finally said what it needed to say. Light spilled through the crystals and scattered across the desk, landing on the velvet tray where the key had rested. Everything in the room looked the same. Nothing did. I pressed play again because I needed to hear it once more, not for proof, but for direction. "Ethan," my grandfather said as if I were 10, and he was handing me a compass. "You are the keeper of the light. Let the light expose the dark." Hank's porch sounded like the shoreline itself, the wind playing his shell chimes into a soft rattle that felt older than the neighborhood. He waved me up with a smile that folded into grief at the edges. And Buddy took the step first like he'd done it 1,000 times. "I wondered when you'd come," Hank said, his voice worn smooth with tide and time. He set a small cassette on the table between two sweating glasses of sweet tea. The plastic cloudy, the label scrolled in my grandfather's blocky hand. "He recorded this for you if things ever got difficult." The player clicked, and my grandfather's voice filled the air, thinner than in life, but unmistakable. He spoke my name, then spoke about guardianship like it was a craft you apprenticed into. "Only Ethan decides," he said, as if standing in court. "Do not let them replace what is true." We let the tape run until the click of leader tape, and Hank fixed me with a look I remembered from childhood when he taught me to tie a line. "There's something else. I saw your father take the real chart out one night, months back late." He thought no one noticed. The porch tilted under me for a second. Betrayal hurts in the present tense, even when you expect it. I wrote it down anyway. We drove to Grace's office, a glass-in rectangle stacked with binders and quiet. She greeted us without ceremony, slid a legal pad toward me, and asked me to lay out the chain, the contract, the dates, the chandelier, the wall, the drive. As I spoke, she drew a simple timeline and anchored it with the will clause that mattered most. The property can only be conveyed with Ethan's personal signature in front of 2 independent witnesses. She read, then underlined independent until the paper threatened to tear. "Electronic won't do. Beneficiaries and buyers can't serve, and if a commission is expired, the notarization is worthless." She lifted her eyes. On its face, their instrument collapses. I handed her printed emails between my mother and Colin Wade. She read silently, then reached for a red pen the way a surgeon reaches for a scalpel. Proposing to swap an original cultural asset for a reproduction before closing, she said, "Tapping the page signals intent, not sloppiness. And when the asset crosses state or national lines with falsified providence, you are in federal territory." She wrote 2 words in the margin, "money laundering," and boxed them in. I slid the thumb drive across the desk. She inserted it into a right-blocked reader, and files spilled across her monitor. Invoices from a specialized printer, scans of shipping labels. Delivery windows that lined up with the days my mother had asked me not to visit spreadsheets that treated maps like inventory at a chain store. Timestamps sat like witnesses who would never forget a face. "We'll preserve the originals with a forensic image," she said, already drafting a preservation letter. "Anything they tried to delete will read as spoliation." We sketched a plan the way you lay out a survey chart. First, secure the real chart if Hank could help us locate it without alerting anyone. Second, serve a notice to maintain the premises and contents of the library intact. Third, approach the buyer privately. Wade has exposure, Grace said. When someone realizes they've been pulled into something bigger than a house sale, they sometimes choose the right side. Fourth sequence, disclosure. She circled the phrase. You don't tip the whole drawer at once. You show just enough at each step to make erasing the past impossible. Hank leaned forward elbows to knee the way men do when they're about to tell the part they hate most. I didn't intervene with your father because I thought I was imagining things he said. But I know what I saw. He carried a tube that wasn't empty. He moved like he was carrying something that mattered. Grace took the statement down verbatim, had him initial next to the line. It wasn't drama. It was a sentence that would stand up when people started pretending they never said what they said. When she turned back to the will, she slid out a thin staple of paper I'd overlooked an addendum in my grandfather's same formal tone. Any act of substitution or forgery regarding estate assets, Grace read, shall immediately disqualify the involved party from all bequests and beneficial interests. She looked at me, the room narrowing to the underline she drew beneath immediately. If we prove what the thumb drive and emails already suggest, your parents' rights aren't just damaged, they're gone. I felt the words lift a weight from the middle of my chest. Not because I wanted anyone poor, but because consequences put shape back around a world someone has tried to melt. We finalized the order of action attached chain of custody forms to the items in Grace's evidence kit and sealed envelopes with my initials crossing the seams. When I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the air tasted like salt and metal. The wind off the harbor caught my shirt, and for a second the city smelled like summers with my grandfather varnish and rope and citrus hand soap. I heard his voice again, not from a speaker this time, but from memory, the sentence he saved for nights when thunder crawled over the water. The beacon shines most when the night refuses to give. I stood there long enough to believe it and then walked toward the work waiting for me. The next morning, my phone lit up before the sun had cleared the marsh. Clips of me spliced mid-sentence flooded every feed. In one, my voice said, I want to let the house go before cutting hard to footage of my mother dabbing at her eye with a tissue. The source file for that interview lived on my own hard drive. In the uncut version, the sentence continued to the community that loved my grandfather, not to a developer. Context is the first thing to die when a story needs a villain. By noon, a local paper had pushed a headline that made my jaw lock. Unstable archivist blocks family's plans. They used a photo of me squinting into wind, which reads as unhinged if you want it to. Trevor Baker went live from the porch framed by the new nameplate like a campaign ad. He spoke into the camera with the practiced ease of someone who believes his reflection. He doesn't care about legacy, he said. He just wants a payday. He laughed and let the comments applaud him. I saved the stream with a quiet click, noted the GPS tag, and put it in the folder I'd labeled Public Claims. You never win by arguing with a flood. You win by channeling it into the record. At the cafe by the harbor, I slid my laptop toward Grace and played the full interview. My voice in context didn't sound unstable. It sounded like someone trying to build a small lighthouse out of a house with good bones. I followed it with the cassette we'd taken from Hank, my grandfather's careful diction filling the soft clamor of cups and milk steamers. Heads turned because integrity catches the ear. This rebuts the narrative and establishes purpose, Grace said. We won't release the drive publicly yet, but we will foreshadow that documentation exists, she typed, while she spoke the letter in legal cadence and clean knuckles. Then the press conference. My mother stood behind a brushed metal podium at the realty office, the company logo hovering over her shoulder like a verdict. She introduced a clinician by name who proceeded to speak about my tendency toward catastrophic thinking, how grief can look like persecution. He didn't diagnose me. That would have been actionable, he insinuated. I watched from the cafe with my hands around a paper cup that cooled faster than coffee should. Grace lifted one eyebrow. They bought a white coat, she said. We'll answer with documents. The first shift in current came from a place I didn't expect. An email pinged my inbox from Colin Wade with a subject line that read, "Regarding recent events," inside a single paragraph that amounted to a confession you could hang your case on. He believed he had been misled about the map swap. He was withdrawing from the transaction. If needed, he was willing to provide a statement. I forwarded it to Grace before I finished reading, then sat back and let myself breathe all the way down for the first time in days. Not because one man's clarity saves anyone, but because truth sounds different in the throat when it finally remembers itself. Grace called within minutes. "Good," she said. "That isolates your parents and Trevor Baker. It removes their shield." She had been working parallel lanes. Through a contact at a bank, she had tracked a transfer into an account in Trevor Baker's name that did not appear in his public footprint. 6 figures. The date matched the appraisal of the replica. She sent me the sanitized confirmation, and I felt for the first time the architecture of their plan. Cash in chart-out houses cover. I wrote the numbers down longhand, the way Grandpa taught me to write coordinates, so I would have to feel each digit. By late afternoon, the story had turned into a storm that couldn't be ignored. Reporters called some aggressive, some careful. I said as little as possible and exactly as much as necessary. There has been a substitution of a heritage asset, I told one camera. I have documentation. I will protect what belongs to the community my grandfather loved. When they pressed for details, I let silence be stronger than speculation. You don't rush the reveal that proves you right. You prepare the ground so that when it arrives, no one can bulldoze it. That evening, my aunt insisted on a family gathering under the guise of mediation. A circle of folding chairs in the den made the room feel like a support group for people who didn't want to be supported. I set my phone on the table and played the full interview. Then the cassette letting my grandfather's voice sit in the spaces where accusations had been living. The room quieted, not because anyone agreed with me, but because the air changed shape around a different center of gravity. Even those who had reposted Trevor Baker's videos stared at the carpet when the cassette said my name with affection and duty braided together. I mentioned the will's requirement for independent witnesses without raising my voice. I mentioned the notary commission's date like you mention a fact in a weather report. I did not mention the thumb drive. Not yet. When the room emptied, a few cousins hugged me in the hallway without saying much. Sometimes a shift begins with an absence of noise. I walked Buddy out to the porch and sat on the top step, the new nameplate catching the last light like it was trying to be important. My phone buzzed an unknown number, a single line of text. No punctuation. "Be careful, someone on the council is in it too." I read it twice and felt the boundaries of the fight redraw themselves. If this had jumped beyond family and business into people with votes and budgets, the current reached further than my street. I forwarded the message to Grace and saved the number in a new contact labeled simply "Caution." The shell chimes from Hank's porch carried across the block in a light breeze. I put my hand on Buddy's head and looked at the thin band of marsh darkening with the sky. The house behind me creaked once the way old beams do when temperature shifts and memory resets itself by a fraction. My grandfather had told me to let the light expose the dark. I hadn't understood until now that sometimes the light has to be widened, made public and bright enough that even people who don't want to see have to squint. The harbor steadied me that morning, salt wind sharp against my lungs, the kind of air that makes you stand straighter. My grandfather had always said, "The sea reminds you where true north is," and I carried his words with me as I walked into the downtown office. The conference room was all glass and polish, a place designed for appearances, but it could not disguise what was waiting to be exposed. Linda sat poised at the head of the table, Thomas slightly behind her, his silence complicit. Trevor Baker scrolled his phone smirk, barely contained. Grace settled at my side with her binder, her calm presence grounding me. Across the glass table sat Colin Wade, tense but present, and two officers who had come to observe what they already suspected. My mother began with her stagecraft projecting the edited video. My voice clipped my image, twisted into something pathetic. She dabbed her eye for effect. "This is what grief does," she said, her voice heavy with false sympathy. Grace leaned forward and pressed play on the uncut file. The truth filled the room. My full words about keeping the house for the community. The spin shattered with a single correction. I laid the replica map on the table, the ink too new to carry the weight of history. Hank entered, then carrying the original. He unrolled it carefully, and when the real chart touched the glass, the difference was undeniable. The officers leaned closer, the air in the room thick with recognition. Grace read directly from the will, her voice cutting steady only with Ethan's personal signature witnessed by two independent parties. She let the addendum fall like a hammer. Any act of substitution or forgery results in immediate disinheritance. I placed the notary page before them, the expired seal, the two false witnesses. Then I set down my conference badge and the time-stamped photograph from Philadelphia. At the very moment you claim I signed, I was 3 states away. The cassette player clicked and my grandfather's voice filled the sterile room. Ethan is the keeper of the light. His faith was alive and every word undeniable. Colin finally spoke, his voice low but clear. I was misled. I'll testify. The air cracked. Grace revealed the bank records. Trevor Baker's hidden transfer, the emails from the laptop. Trevor jolted from his seat, half ready to bolt, but the officers rose with calm certainty. Linda's mask cracked when the cuffs closed. Thomas bowed his head. Silence settled, broken only by the sound of pen on paper as evidence was logged. I stayed seated as they were led away, my reflection staring back at me in the glass table. What shone there wasn't the harsh light of fixtures above, but the brighter light of truth finally uncovered. The house returned to me not as spoils, but as a trust fulfilled. The porch creaked under my step, the oak trees bent low with autumn gold, and the air moved through the rooms like breath. I began not by restoring silence, but by inviting voices back in. The library became a living place again. Children tracing coastlines on charts, teachers guiding them through old letters, neighbors leaving their own records in shoeboxes for safekeeping. Buddy sprawled near the doorway, a sentinel who greeted each arrival. Retired dock workers sat by the window sharing stories of tides and trade. Lights slanted across the table, falling on faces bent over books and maps. The creak of the floor now a rhythm of belonging. Hank arrived one afternoon with a small plaque wrapped in cloth. The brass gleamed as I unwrapped it. He remembers what matters. We fixed it to the porch where the false nameplate had once hung. Passers-by stopped to read, nodding as if they too had been waiting for this house to remember itself. Grace visited often, not as a lawyer, but as someone who wanted to witness what had been rebuilt. She smiled, watching a child scan an old map, her laughter spilling as easily as the tide. "Most cases end in silence," she said softly. "This one shines."